Check this out. Beautiful, isn't it? Oh, snap. About broke my ankle. I was thinking about the nature of hypocrisy. And I got to thinking, is hypocrisy ever rational? When I was younger, kind of the culture was around here was that if you had a biting child, there's a child that just bites everybody, brothers, sisters, peers, cousins, mommy, daddy, kindergarten teacher. The idea was if you bit the child back, it would understand that, ow, this sucks. This is not only really sucky, but I kind of understand why I shouldn't do it. The idea was the kid would maybe become empathic a little bit, and it would serve the kid well in the future. The hypocrisy lies in that the parent, first off, we're not talking about gnawing the kid's finger off, okay? The idea was there's just a little squeeze. Of course, this was the 80s. Things were different then. But the kid would kind of understand empathy, and justice would be served. However, hypocrisy lies in that the parent or the person doing the biting is anti-bite. You don't do that. So why would they want to do something that they think is bad, that is antithetical to, let's say, virtue? Because it's not virtuous to go around biting people. So I guess one could say that there's a couple of things to consider, like the intent of the parent. Is the intent to just hurt the kid? Was the intent maybe to provide a moral lesson for the kid? Was it to retaliate? That would suck. Or was it just absolute ignorance of the parent? Which, there's a lot of ignorant parents, unfortunately. To get slightly more academic, if you look into hypocrisy, there's a lot of, well, not a lot, but there is literature. These nets are terrible, I'm sorry. There is literature on the psychology of hypocrisy, and a lot of it revolves around cognitive dissonance and so on and so forth. That's kind of what I want to talk about, but not absolutely what I want to talk about. I think if there's a willingness to go into, and foreknowledge to go into something that is hypocritical, then probably cognitive dissonance is a decent explanation, which is ironically undergirded by utilitarian thought. That is, the greater good, probably the greater good for the greater number of people, because if your kid's going around biting everybody, your kid's going to get in trouble, get, I don't know, smacked in the mouth by another kid, and that's not good. You don't want your kid biting everybody. If the hypocrisy exists simply because you're unable to see the hypocrisy, I think that is a different explanation than cognitive dissonance. I think this would be better understood as, dare I say something Freudian, but a subconscious thing, like denial. Denial. It's not just a river, is it, folks? That was so cringe. Whether it is cognitive dissonance or denial, I would say both of those things fall under the user's form of ethic. What does that mean? Well, I'm not going to delve very deeply into ethics. I think that's another conversation. It's interesting to bring up the perception of ethics. In other words, what is right and wrong? And maybe also, do ends justify the means? Maybe is harm always bad? Maybe something that looks more like spare the rod, spoil the child. That'd probably get contentious. In any case, I think that it revolves around the worldview, and the worldview is largely built on ethics, and then though the ethics are justified by the worldview, because I don't believe that humans inherently think themselves to be wrong, ever. In fact, I don't think that we're ever wrong on purpose. That is another very lengthy conversation that maybe I'll make a video on, because that sounds hypocritical. Herein lies another issue. Get off of me. This is another interesting conversation. I don't think that we are very good at delineating between an explanation and a justification. So, what is the difference between an explanation and a justification? Largely, and probably superficially, an explanation is how something is. A justification is why something is. So, for example, I may have an explanation for the wheel. Okay, I explain how the wheel was formed and how it works, and then I justify its workings because of, well, how it works and how it may improve the need for other wheels because of productivity. That may very well be a circular argument. Or I could explain how a flashlight works, circuitry, so on and so forth, and then maybe justify the need for how the flashlight can improve my life. The point here being is the kids, get off me. But then when we explain ideologies and beliefs, it's really difficult because of an ideology inherently being a belief structure. It's really hard not to justify the explanation. Pretty easy to understand because we don't believe things that we don't have an underpinning for. In other words, we justify our beliefs. If we believe the wheel is good, we'll justify why it's good. If we think the wheel should be square, no matter how irredeemable our belief may be, we will try to justify it. So ideologies are different than the wheel because they demand both the explanation and justification simultaneously. If someone explains how biting their child very softly and gently may promote the child being a better person and such that they may stop biting everyone that they meet, held within that is the justification for why you bite your child. And it's impossible to remove hypocrisy from that. Hypocrisy is inevitable. I don't think that it can be avoided because humans are fallible. We are fallible, greedy creatures. And as a consequence of being fallible, greedy creatures who are greedy even over their thoughts, well, we face the inevitable demise of being able to be logically consistent and thus are hypocritical. Let's talk a little bit more about ought and should as it relates to hypocrisy. But this is going to get a little deep. The relationship between natural law and progress is pretty interesting. Maybe asking, what does that have to do with hypocrisy and the psychological nature of hypocrisy? We're going to get there. Also, in case you're wondering, maybe you don't know, what is natural law? Natural law can be defined several different ways, and it depends upon the theorist who is actually kind of proposing an assertion or making a claim about it. There's been a lot of theorists like Thomas Aquinas. It's often attributed to like the Greeks, the Stoics, underscoring their proposition. The main focus, irrespective of who is making the claim or what group of people is making the claim, is there's this undergirding, this universal, objective, yet difficult to define essence that kind of allows us to discover a form of ethic. Like, it's a discoverable thing. It is reasonable, logical. Aquinas actually, he believed that good was to be done and evil to be avoided, and that this precept was independently conditional or unconditional. Those aren't his words, by the way. Meaning that it exists absolutely. It was objectively the case. Okay. And we could discover this through reason and so on and so forth. And that was his, I guess, idea of moral law. Attributed this to God. I'm not going to get all theological. Truth is true, irregardless of one's belief or acceptance of it. It's just, it exists. It is there. So the natural law is kind of like that. It is unchanging. It doesn't evolve. And that is where this conversation is going to go. Because I think there is an interesting worldview, or dare I say evolution of worldview, based on one's acceptance or denial of natural law, and their acceptance or denial of evolution, whether evolutionary theory in biology, psychology, spirituality. So one idea, and I think this is reasonable to assert, is that natural law is completely antithetical to the nature of progress, in that progress is inherent in the claim, or inherently claims rather, that evolution occurs, evolution being change over time. And natural law is asserting that something is and is always and is unchanging. So it sets the preconditions that are completely opposite of any evolutionary moral progress. Man, these gnats. In other words, there's a natural order to things. And anything that deviates from the natural order is, well, not natural. The other idea is if something can occur, then it will occur, and that is natural. That's what the evolutionary argument would be. And there is no should or ought or moral argument to that supposition at all. If X thing happens, then X thing is natural. In other words, X would not happen without the proclivity of X happening. Again, did I mention a wheel being circular earlier? This is in deep contrast to what we think of as natural law, but it's very consistent with the evolutionary notion that things are happenstance, or any input that is placed upon a system that makes it change is, well, there's neither fault nor direction placed on the system necessarily. In other words, it just happens. It just happens. Now, I'm not going to get into Darwinian theory and stuff. That's not what this is about. I mean, there might be reasons that the evolution, that the change happened as it did, but it was a product of a stimulus. It was a product of a stimulus. That stimulus was also probably a product of another stimulus, and so on and so forth. You see where I'm going with this? There's nothing that exists outside of stimuli. That's kind of what I'm talking about. But then they will also go on and say, and because it happened, it's just natural. This gets murky. Here is how the argument goes. Some things that were natural yesterday are not natural today because evolution. So consequently, evolution can always kind of be the scapegoat in a way. Just like those who say or make the claim that Christians use God as a scapegoat. This is so silly. You see where hypocrisy comes in here? Atheists often refer to this as God of the gaps fallacy. There's no logical consistency with that. That's just as hypocritical as suggesting that, well, evolution. In other words, if it's always, yay, evolutionary progress, if that is always the answer, then there can never be an ought. Maybe we should talk about oughts for a second. Most people, when talking about this philosophically, the nature of an ought is, this idea is often attributed to Kant, Immanuel Kant. Kant believed that an ought was this moral obligation, duty to do good, and that it was unconditional, meaning that conditions could not be applied to the ought, and it was not subjective. Okay. While I largely agree with this, I'm probably even more an absolutist than Kant. I'm not going to do a review on categorical of Kant's categorical imperative. Look that up yourself. Read about it. Read some literature. So if things only happen as a consequence of evolution, then there can't be an ought. In fact, everything is natural, and consequences only give rise to themselves. Let me chew on that for a second. Cause and effect necessarily exist. If I get hit in the mouth hard enough, I'm going to bleed. That caused the punch. Caused me to bleed. Effect. Cause and effect exist. I think delegating every single supposition a priori to cause and effect is probably a little fallacious, probably a little hypocritical. It also precludes any assertion that natural law could exist. I'll get back on that in just a second, maybe. So with that said, natural doesn't even exist. There cannot be a natural. Natural is ethereal at best. And if there is no natural, and there is no ought, then, well, those things seemingly underscore the entire moral principles of moral relativists. This inherently assumes that there is nothing larger than the self, and that the self is the only, if I may use the word dictator, path toward that which is good. We're going to talk about good too, because there can't be a good without an ought. At least I don't see how. You may say, dude, you're wrong, because there ought to be progress, there ought to be good, there ought to be peace, there ought to be love, there ought to be... I'm like, yeah, so... But it's not the case. What do we do to get there? Maybe your answer is to be a good person. Be good, dude. Just be awesome to people. You know, love them and care for them. I do. No, you don't. Here comes the introduction to relativity. But I'm going to hold off on that for just a second. So, if these things are the case, and I'm making an assertion that it is the case, that is my claim, well then why? What would be a psychological analysis of why this may be the case? Okay, so let's say that someone who has really hoped and wanted some semblance of order in their life, they haven't found it, and so they've only had chaos. They have, while even looking for order, they have found the antithesis of order, which is chaos, and they continue the chaos and hope to find order. That sounds wildly absurd. But then what happens is you have chaos group with chaos, because that is the acceptance of the order. There is order in that chaos, in that madness, in that anxiety, in that belief structure, that whatever it takes to survive, that group of belonging is safer and more organized, irrespective of any chaotic practices or thoughts or beliefs. They're ordered in that. If you have 40 people thinking 40 different things, that is counter-structural. That is whatever non-conforming idea of structure that you may, whether you take a deconstructionist approach, whatever. They don't have to agree on any of the ways that they think this disorder is best served. They just have to agree that the order is antithetical to their existence, and that foundation in and of itself intrinsically is order. And a lot of these values and beliefs are held from a very deep, painful place, man. Really painful place. It's like you've had resentment build up in you your entire life. Nothing in your life has went right. You've had terrible parental control, if your parents have been there at all. Maybe you've bounced around from home to home to home. Maybe you've lived on the streets for way too many years in your adolescent life. It's just chaos all around. You've accepted that order doesn't exist. When we identify with other people who have shared our experiences, irrespective of the chaos and the dysfunction, that have the same anger and reticence to accept any semblance of order, we align ourselves with those people because we need to belong to a group. We need to belong. We need to be accepted. We need to be cared for. That care governs the order of the dysfunction. You want to talk about cause and effect? Man, there is no better example of cause and effect than when anger grows. If we're already angry and already resentful, and we find other reasons to become more angry and resentful, and we find it impossible to find an antidote for that, and maybe the best antidote that we can come up with is to belong to a group and feel cared for and seen and heard, irrespective if the group, even if they have our best interest, are not good at displaying it. Like they're a terrible example for us. And we're not particularly a good example for them either. And yet, we can easily call that order. In other words, it is the search for order. Why are we searching for order? Because it's fundamentally and necessarily known. There's an intrinsic, ubiquitous understanding that there is safety in order. Some believe that they have to create chaos in order to obtain that order, but it's still for safety. And that understanding, it seems intrinsic. For others, they don't really buy into this. They don't believe it. They don't see the world this way. They think that there is a natural way to be, a natural way to think. They believe that there ought to be a good and bad, right and wrong, so on and so forth. Ought, should. They would even say it's imperative. Because to these people, the structures with which morality exists is fundamental to a society that doesn't collapse. And given societies ought not collapse, well, good societies ought not collapse. Well, there ought to be something that is intrinsically and necessarily good to prevent said collapse. This ought is from something that they believe it exists outside of themselves. And this is where good comes in, the definition of good. You know, I've often thought about the various ways that people can believe something or define something is good. Whether it's a political assassination, whether it is a hamburger, whether it is forestry, whether it is pumpkin pie, it doesn't matter. What is it that allows people psychologically to accept something as good or bad? And I've concluded after years of thinking about this, is that those who believe something is necessarily or independently or intrinsically good see good, and I just said the word, they see good as an independent variable. In other words, it is not dependent upon something else. It just is. Conversely, some people will see good as it depends. In other words, it's a dependent variable. And this, I think, really, really, at the heart of it, defines theology, political structures, and thoughts and philosophies. Because some will live very happily in a gray area, and some will not. But as this video is about the nature of hypocrisy, even those whose presuppositions will claim that good is necessarily independent, how are they feeling that day? Man, they're just as eager to be hypocritical as anybody else. I can't point fingers, but I genuinely do accept that the best analysis in political thought is whether good is defined dependently or independently. I think it's that simple. Neither is inoculated from hypocrisy, sadly. This reminds me of Schopenhauer's idea of will and representation. Schopenhauer, he was this philosopher. Look him up. His theories of pessimism are pretty awesome. I think they explain human psychology far better than any theorist since the 70s. But anyway, he believed that when things are satisfactory and we feel satisfied, that's when we are unhappy. And he justifies this claim by saying that we are always in a state of deficiency, meaning we can always want, but if we obtain, we're just going to want more. I bring that up only to illustrate that strife is inevitable. And given that humans inherently will justify whatever position that they're holding, unless they're just outright lying, then they'll justify that too. It's another conversation. But because we both obtain and are deficient and thusly miserable, we're always going to hope to satisfy some claim and then convince others to agree with us, because there's power in numbers, right? Safety, safety, safety. I don't know why you should listen to me. I'm a hypocrite. Probably be hypocritical to deny that. I'm also just this idiot on the internet, just giving his views on the world. Started this channel because I wanted to draw all these concepts out. Maybe I'll get back to that, doing it more properly. What a beautiful day. I'm happy about that. And that doesn't mean that hypocrisy can't be minimized. I think there's a lot of room to suggest that hypocrisy can be minimized, and if one is in favor of the linguistic game, such as saying should and ought, it ought to be minimized. We should minimize hypocrisy. Dare I say, it is our duty. Maybe I'll do a video over deontology. I think that'd be neat, specifically as it relates to hypocrisy. That'd be cool. So when we're pointing fingers at people pointing fingers, we are all guilty of it. I think the old adage is that when you point at someone, you have 3 fingers pointing back at yourself. It's kind of ridiculous and silly. Nonetheless, this point is illustrative of how we are largely incapable of seeing our own hypocrisy, which it circles back around. As I said, this is a rather circular thing, admittedly, to intent and and awareness. How aware are we of our own hypocrisy? If we're not aware of our hypocrisy, I do believe that is far more detrimental to any utilitarian thought. And I am no proponent of utilitarianism, though hypocritically I can say that it can be meaningful sometimes. I think that's that.